On this episode of Simply Offensive, I'm joined by OT and ICS expert Mike Holcomb. Mike and I discuss ICS OT security as well as pen testing some of the types of attacks that have been performed against like water treatment facilities and different types of OT ICS environments, as well as Mike will discuss learning opportunities to learn OT and ICS security and pen testing. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of Simply Offensive. Today I'm joined by Mike Holcomb. Mike is an expert in the OT arena, and in this episode you'll get to learn a little bit more about OT and OT pen testing. Mike has some great content out there which we'll be sharing in the show notes, but Mike does a lot of great stuff for the community, puts out some great posts on LinkedIn. It's kind of interesting to see some of the different rankings and stuff, and Mike is rated up there with the people at the top when it comes to content creation and cybersecurity influencers. So welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Phillip. Yeah, it's always good to catch up. So I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And it was great to finally get to meet you in person. We got to meet back in Atlanta at the ICS conference there.
Yeah, it feels like a million years ago already.
It does. It hasn't been that long ago, but that was been April, and it seems like, it seems a long time ago. This year has gone by really quick.
It has. It really has. Too fast.
So if you wouldn't mind, for the listeners, kind of introducing yourself and share your background.
Sure. My name's Mike Holcomb. I am been an IT cybersecurity nerd since day one. It's kind of what I've always wanted to do since junior high. So I've just always done IT cybersecurity. And then back in 2010, I became interested in OT or ICS cybersecurity when I heard about the Stuxnet malware that had taken control over physical systems, the centrifuges at this facility in Iran, and was able to break down those systems, and it hid the activity from the operators that were sitting in the control room. And I just absolutely fascinated with that. And that's where I got started in OT ICS cybersecurity. So I'm in my last month at one of the world's largest engineering companies. And so I actually work with some of the world's best engineers in designing and helping secure some of the world's largest OT or ICS environments. And so it's where I've been for almost 15 years. And so I just, really focus on sharing, awareness and education for folks that want to get into the field, or people that are already working in plants and they want to improve their cybersecurity programs. And so I post a lot on, like you mentioned, LinkedIn and YouTube for folks that, they just want to learn about OT, ICS, cybersecurity, and they want to build out their programs. In fact, I just probably about 5-6 weeks ago started to release my pen testing course for OT, ICS, cybersecurity. So first 4 parts are out, and part 5 actually drops hopefully before the end of the week. So
very cool. There. So how many parts is in that series? Is that the final part of the course?
No, actually, it's a good question, because I have some really long sections. I've taught this live, I think, twice now, but I realized that it might be too long and too detailed in some areas. So it'll probably be 10 parts, I suspect. So it'll probably be close to like 20 hours of content. So, and then I'll have some other like side courses that go with, like I have a 4-hour workshop around kind of customizing like Kali Linux and tools for just OT, ICS, pen testing, things like that.
Also, does anyone need to have any kind of pen testing background to take that course?
You don't have to. It's like any course, you don't have to. And of course, it's on YouTube, so you can always check it out. And if you feel like it's maybe a little too much, you can always take a step back. I do have, for folks that are new to, just pen testing, definitely want to check out, all the IT pen testing resources that are out there. If you want to learn more about the fundamentals of OT or ICS cybersecurity, I also have a course that's about 26 hours on all the kind of covering the fundamentals of what it is and how we secure power plants and water treatment facilities and manufacturing. And so I have that out there as well. So, but I've had, people with little to no pen test background go through it and say, they've had a lot of fun with it and realize, hey, this isn't so hard, and which is really concerning when you think about it, right? Because from that attacker perspective, it's not necessarily that hard to attack a lot of these environments and have an actual impact.
And for the listeners or viewers, please put in the comments if you're familiar with ICS and OT, or if you're working in any companies that have those type of environments. So kind of share those comments so we can get a little bit of a conversation going and kind of connect with each other. And so one of the things before we get very much deeper, if you wouldn't mind explaining what OT and ICS are for those that may not be familiar.
Sure, sure. Operational technology or O, or OT is a very umbrella term. So it's basically any, I would say, computer or system that controls a physical system or piece of equipment out in the real world. So if I have a power plant, I have a computer that controls the turbine, right? That turbine spins and in turn will spin a generator which creates electricity. But I use that computer, or in this case, we might say like a programmable logic controller, to be able to watch that turbine over time and then adjust different variables. So let's say that turbine starts to go a little too fast or a little too slow, or what if it starts to overheat, right? We need to be able to adjust the process to make sure we're still generating electricity appropriately, right? And we're not breaking anything at the same time. So that's kind of what we call OT, but OT is a big bucket, right? Because you can have a computer that controls other things that move in the world, like parts in the car or medical equipment. So everything that moves and is controlled by a computer is really falls under this OT bucket. Industrial control systems, that's where we get into the industrial settings like power plants, other critical infrastructure like water treatment, or talk about like pharmaceutical manufacturing, food manufacturing plants. So that's really ICS. So systems that control and monitor equipment in the real world have a process that they're responsible for, like generate electricity or put food in a can, right, and seal that before it goes into a box to get shipped. Those types of things.
So how similar is IoT to these type of systems?
There's some kind of overlap these days, but the IoT is still, I still think of it very much as like I got Alexa sitting over on the kitchen counter, right? I still always think of, it's more like home electronic. Sometimes you see them right in business or office environments. They require internet connectivity to work. Typically, the last thing we want to see in an OT environment like a power plant is internet connectivity, because that's the number one route that an attacker or a pen tester would take to access the environment. But yeah, there's definitely some kind of gray area these days. So we start to almost see like sensors, right? So if I want to watch what's going on in the environment, we deploy sensors, and those sensors are almost like IoT devices. These are some of the newer ones. So it's a really interesting space. And of course, it's one that's evolving very quickly. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are thinking about cybersecurity when it comes to these devices and these protocols. So when you think from a pen testing or an attacker perspective, obviously that's not a good thing.
Yeah, just to kind of touch back on something you mentioned earlier, Stuxnet. So in the current like geopolitical environment, just the way things are these days, do you think there's higher risks of these OT ICS type of attacks now than what there previously were in the past?
Yeah, well, the landscape really changed 4 years ago with the Colonial Pipeline breach. And for folks that aren't aware, that's where we had the largest gasoline pipeline in the United States go down for 10 days. And it actually had an impact for some people, and especially the East Coast had challenges getting gasoline for their cars and other things. And so that a lot of owners and operators of OT or ICS environments, they realized, hey, we need to do something about cybersecurity in our plants. So it's very much kind of like the target breach was in the IT world, but for OT or ICS. So all these plant operators realized we need to at least put this on the to-do list. Some still haven't got to that part of their to-do list, unfortunately, but some will. But yeah, since Colonial Pipeline, what we've seen is an increase, and it's almost doubling every year, where the number of attackers and the number of attacks that are impacting these OT environments is going up year after year. Now, there's really kind of two main types of attacks. There's ones where the attacker can get into the plant, like a manufacturing plant. And a lot of people don't realize that OT or ICS environments, they're made up of a lot of Windows machines, believe it or not. And so if you have IT pen test experience, it's like I remember when I walked into my first power plant back in 2012, and the manager was giving me a tour, and he takes me into their data center, and he's like, "Oh, here's our domain controllers." I was like, "You have Active Directory in a power plant?" Like I had no clue. I was like, "Well, I know 100 different ways to break into that machine, and take control over everything." He's like, "Here's a data historian where they store telemetry data of how the environment works, all that monitoring data I was mentioning earlier. It's a Windows server running SQL Server. Well, I know how, 100 different ways to break into that system." So there's Windows everywhere in OT. So an attacker can either get into the OT environment and then impact those Windows machines, or they can then impact what we call phase two attacks. They can impact the PLCs, the HMI, those other true OT or ICS assets in the environment, right? That monitor and control those physical systems and processes. The other way, and like we've seen with, if you've probably the biggest incident we've seen is Jaguar Land Rover, right? Where they had, $2 billion lost because all of their global manufacturing plants were down for upwards of 5 weeks. Some of them still aren't completely online. And that was not because the attacker got into the OT environment, but they got into the IT environment, and all the IT systems were down. And so a lot of OT environments, especially in manufacturing, they depend on information from IT. So if you take IT down, you can take some OT operations down. Not all, but some, especially manufacturing.
So yeah, thinking of some of the attacks too. What was it a couple years ago? There was like around the end of the year that there was a water treatment facility in Florida that got attacked.
Yeah, Oldsmar, which was interesting, was that's where an attacker found basically what they call an engineering workstation. It's just a Windows machine, right? That they had installed TeamViewer on and had a really weak password on it. The attacker found that, logged in, and basically when they logged into that engineering workstation, they had access to what they call the human machine interface. What that is it's just a GUI, it's like a dashboard, and then basically it shows, hey, here's the water treatment plant, here's the process, right? Here's where we clean the water. There's a dial where you can turn it all the way up to increase the amount of chemicals put into the water. So the attacker got onto the machine, turns the amount of lye, essentially, chemicals put in the water, all the way up to where it would be a deadly amount. And if that water had gone out to the public and they drank it, then they would have died. Well, a couple of things to think about there is one that the alarms were going off. The operator, right, sitting there, realized what happened. Yeah, and they stopped it right away. The other thing is, even let's say if the water was poisoned, there's other physically engineered controls in place. So even if let's say that water was deadly and it started to go out to the public, there's other controls to do things like check the water to see if it's safe to drink. And if it detected that unsafe condition, it would actually shut off the water. So it would actually never get out to the public. So that's why, especially when you talk about critical infrastructure, people think that we can make a power plant blow up, or we can poison the water and it can get out to the public. A lot of these facilities, right, have these additional engineered controls, physically engineered controls that aren't dependent on cyber in any way, that stand alone, and that they're there for safety to be able to shut things down in the event. So yeah, that was Oldsmar. We also had where the Cyber Avengers, which is a hacktivist group out of Iran, were finding these PLCs and HMIs, kind of these combination devices that were exposed to the internet. So they're using Shodan, just like everybody else, to find these devices exposed to the internet. They have a default password of 11111. They're logging in. The devices are manufactured in Israel, and they're mostly used in water treatment and breweries. So there were a lot of breweries and water treatment facilities, especially in the US, got hit. They defaced the GUI, and then they would just basically wipe the logic or that would control like the water cleaning process, the water treatment or the brewery. So actually, those were very limited. Most of the environments, what they do is you can fall back to manual operations, which means you're not using the computers to run like the water treatment or to generate electricity. You're actually humans are watching the process, right? They're monitoring, right? They're flipping switches, turning dials if they need to make adjustments. So you're taking the computers out of the equation for that period of time until you can restore the environment and get back up and running. But it's like any incident response, you have to make sure, right? The attackers are out of the environment. And of course, in OT or ICS, our primary requirement is always safety. So we want to make sure, is the environment safe to put back under monitoring and control over of those systems.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing about those environments that how in traditional IT environments, you have to worry about the risk of people's health or, a lot of risk of the manufacturing process, things, losing money based on, overuse of certain products, overflowing and that kind of stuff. But it's just kind of interesting that the OT environment has those to deal with. I used to work for a company that had an OT environment, and they didn't want us pen testing their environment. They didn't want security in their environment because of those risks.
It's kind of that, I guess, a double-edged sword, right? If you want security, it's like, how do you get it, right? And we can implement controls, and when you look at OT security versus IT security, some people will say, and I hate this, there are some people in OT cybersecurity that say OT and IT cybersecurity are nothing alike, which is complete garbage, right? They are actually more similar then they're different. The gotcha, though, is that where they are different, they are very different. And when they're very different, it's important to understand where they're different and how they're different, because you can end up with a condition where you could get somebody hurt, you could get somebody killed. And obviously that's not something that anybody wants to do. I would have been, I 2012 when I went into my first power plant, I would have been, hey, all these PLCs that haven't been updated in 10 years, right? You need to update them and reboot. We've got someone hurt, somebody killed, or I would have, brought down the power plant, right? Obviously, we don't want any of those things happening. So they have much more in common. So it's great. Like for myself, right? When I came from IT cybersecurity, people coming today, right? A lot of those basics. It's just about learning the differences. And the same thing with seen in OT. It's learning the differences and how it works to then make it work for if you're doing pen testing, right? For your company or for your client to help them identify those risks that they have that they need to address.
Yeah, you mentioned there's a lot of Windows used in those environments. The versions of those Windows that they're using in those environments, are those typically outdated versions of the operating system?
Yeah, usually when you build a facility, right, you'll install whatever current Windows version of the day is, right? So plants that are getting installed today, they probably have Windows 11 for the engineering workstations. They have whatever the latest version of Windows is on the server side. But if you think of a power plant that was built 20 years ago, right, they have Windows 2000, right? Or what about there's still plants running Windows 95, Windows NT, and 351, right? So and that's really interesting because when you think about it, it does make things like incident response more difficult because and pen testing. Because when you think it's like, when's the last time you pen tested like NT351? Of course, it probably would be really easy, right? Super easy. It's like, oh my gosh, where do I still get the tools? Or when you do incident response, how do we do memory forensics on NT351, right? 32-bit. It's having to go back that far in time. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Those are some of those challenges. So it just depends on when that environment was built. Because yeah, once you like if we build that environment today and you're running like Windows 11, the latest version of Windows Server, we're not upgrading those operating systems over time. They might be patching, and they definitely should be patching, but they're probably not upgrading the operating system over time.
Yes. So, for someone that wants to get into OT pen testing, what do you recommend?
Well, check out my class on YouTube. That's always a great place to start. But I would also say master the IT pen test fundamentals. So what you'll actually see, and just like we were mentioning earlier, that couple of things to think about. So we already talked about that most OT or ICS environments there's a lot of Windows machines there. So if you were to go to a company, especially ones that specialize in OT or ICS pen testing, I say that most 70, 80, sometimes 90% of OT pen tests that people are paying for, they're actually just IT pen tests, which means you're just moving from Windows system to Windows system. You're not even touching any OT or ICS equipment. So most are like assumed breach scenarios. So you get a foothold on the IT network, right? We assume the attacker is going to get there, and then it's, oh, can you get into, so if we have a DMZ between IT and OT, can you get onto one of the systems in the DMZ? Those are almost always Windows machines. And then, okay, and that's probably 80% of OT pen tests. That's it. And then maybe another 10% is, oh, can you get a foothold from there in the OT environment on one of those machines? And maybe you pull out Bloodhound, right? You take full control over Active Directory, right? And you have access to all of those Windows machines, and then you're done. That's 90% of OT ICS pen testing, because you have to remember the number one requirement, right, in OT or ICS cybersecurity is safety. And if we started actually touching those OT systems like PLCs and HMIs and others that monitor and control these processes, you can actually cause physical impact in the real world, which also includes things that could get people hurt, people killed, right? What if the alarm didn't go off in that Oldsmar situation, and the engineers didn't have that physically engineered, safety control to check the water, and we actually did have deadly water get out to the public because we were doing a pen test and we just didn't know what we were necessarily doing. Right. So there's a lot of danger. So when we really start talking about testing those OT or ICS environments, that's where we really look at doing that in a test environment or in a digital twin environment, right? Where we have a virtualized environment that we've replicated that we can test against. But we always have to ensure safety. I actually was listening to a podcast just the other week where there were these two guys doing OT pen testing in Europe, and they were talking about, oh yeah, we know which systems not to scan because they'll crash. And then they're like, oh yeah, we crashed a power plant, but it was okay. It wasn't, it's like, no, that's not okay. So it's,
So,
yeah, but yeah.
yeah, not even taking into consideration crashing, is there the chance that if someone's doing an OT pen test that they could actually cause destruction to the equipment?
Exactly. Especially if you look at like a turbine in a power plant, if you were to actually break that, there's a 3-year waiting list on that. And so do you really want a 3-year-old, 3-year blackout because you were pen testing the wrong thing? No, of course not. Right. And accidents happen. So yeah, that's why we just don't take those chances.
So I know you mentioned some tools that are traditionally used in pen testing. Are there any specialized tools that are used during an OT pen test?
It's a good question. You can still, if you're doing active scanning, especially in test environments. So Nmap is still an off, right? It's my favorite tool still of all time. And there's Nmap scripts that are developed to do things like discovery and collection for OT protocols. So that's actually a go-to still for folks, believe it or not. So yeah, there's OT protocols like Modbus, DMP3, Ethernet IP. These are all protocols that they were written 20, 30 years ago. So nobody was thinking about security back then. These are all unauthenticated protocols. So you can connect and you can issue commands, no username, no password. That's why I always say like testing or having an impact can actually be very easy. You just, if you want to be able to do that in a controlled manner, that's what's difficult. But yeah, you see Nmap, right? We see Wireshark for watching, to see what's going on. Most traffic in OT environments is unencrypted, so you actually pretty much see everything. from that perspective. There are a lot of like the kind of custom tools that you'll see in OT. A lot of them are old. So what I find is, most were written for Python 2, if you're lucky. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll either rewrite those in ChatGPT or Gemini, right? I'm not a developer, don't pretend to be, but you can rewrite them in Gen AI usually really quickly, really easily. I do a lot of these in the pen test class. So not only creating tools, but also the virtualized environments that you can actually test. But yeah, there are a few tools out there, like PLC scan would be a kind of like an old school tool that people would use to find PLCs and enumerate them. But again, it's one of those that's super old. You can't even run it on like the latest version of Kali Linux. So it's like, what am I going to do with that? So it's like, I'll just write, my own version that works and do it.
Since you mentioned Gen AI, so how useful has AI been for you and your day to day doing security for OT and pen testing?
Yeah, I actually did. I just did a session earlier for on that. I've been talking a lot about using Gen AI, especially for people that are either new to the field or let's say like I'm in IT cybersecurity and I just got responsibility for a plant. And I'm like, where do I start? Gen AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, they can be great tools to get started. Obviously, we have to say, right, they're not perfect. You shouldn't implement anything without getting approval from engineering of those plants. Again, we're enforcing safety and availability. Right? We don't want the plant to come down, right? Especially if you don't have any resources, which is what most of these environments are. Right? They don't have somebody for OT cybersecurity. They might not have somebody for IT cybersecurity. So what do you do for resources when you have no money? You can use ChatGPT for free, and so why I can't blame you if you do. So yeah, I think it's great for that. And like I said, I've been using it a lot to create virtualized environments that we can attack, right? So you can learn just like in IT, right? I want to learn how do attackers attack an OT environment so I can learn to sure not only do the attacks myself, which is super fun and in authorized environments that are safe, but also how to allows us to understand how better to defend those environments ultimately.
So how difficult is it to virtualize an OT environment?
Thankfully to ChatGPT and the others, it actually I've come up with the platforms have come up with some pretty cool little environments. So like I start off with kind of the example in the class starts out with the example of like a thermostat and it controls an air conditioning unit, and that could be for your house or it could be a massive data center. I have one client that's manufacturing and that they have 3 air conditioning units that each one's the size of my house, right? But from an attacker or a cybersecurity perspective, it's all the same. I think a lot of people don't realize that, and so it can create environments like that. Or what if, like the old smart example we were talking about earlier, right? Create a environment like that you can simulate, or create one where there was where the Russians had created a real simple piece of malware that turned off the heating in 600 apartment buildings, not just apartments, but a 600 apartment buildings in Ukraine. And so those types of controllers, they're exposed there's still 50 of them that you can find through Shodan on the internet in the Ukraine. And so I built out a simulated version of those. So, and it's 5, 10, 15 minutes sometimes to create these environments that can actually look and operate like real control systems. So it's really, really, really cool. Great learning tools for folks to get to see not only how easy these attacks are to conduct at times, but also how defending these environments can be very simple and straightforward. It might sound complex or complicated at first, but it's like anything, right? Once you start to learn it, once you master the basics, oh, you know what? It's not as complicated as it seems.
Very cool. That's nice to be able to have ways to virtualize those environments because, traditional IT environments can be expensive enough, but for someone to try to set up a home lab to emulate OT environment would be mega expensive.
Exactly. Yeah. I think my first PLC I bought off of eBay, it was like $500, and that was a used one. And then I think work had bought a fairly nice Siemens, set. That was like $1,500, right? And these are the cheap ones. I always tell people, if you want physical equipment, check out Automation Direct. Not They're not a sponsor, but you could get a fully loaded PLC for $400, which is for brand new, fully loaded. You can't beat that price, and they have a lot of free courses. It's actually the PLC that SANS uses in all of their ICS security courses.
Oh,
So
cool.
that's where they get the SANS stamp of approval as well. But yeah, so definitely it can be very expensive. So that's and I have people I connect with all over the world, right? And they're from parts of the world that they don't have 400 US to spend on something like that. So it's here's a Python script that you can run on just about any system, and it simulates an entire maybe water treatment facility, and you can use that. Or there's some great virtual platforms also that folks have created. One's called LabShock, which created by Earth Hart, and Zachar is his first name, and it simulates like an oil pumping station. And so you got the kind of simulated PLC you have that we were talking about, right? That monitors and makes changes to the equipment, and HMI and GUI, right? That dashboard interface, and has an engineering workstation, and it even has a virtualized version of Kali Linux built in. So it's really cool. He went all out. So I definitely suggest people check out LabShock, which is on GitHub, and it's free for personal use.
Very cool. So we're getting down towards the end of the episode. Could you share with the audience where they can find you?
Yeah, definitely. You can find my website at mikeholcomb.com. That points to all my other places. Special thanks to my girlfriend who put that together. And so, but LinkedIn, I'm always on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect, reach out, ask questions. And then my YouTube, you can either Google for Mike Holcomb, or it's under UtilSec. So kind of like utility security. UtilSec would be a YouTube channel that has all the courses.
Very cool. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today.
But thanks for the invite. It's always good to catch up.
Thanks everyone for joining. Make sure to subscribe and share with your friends. And until next time, take care.